Good afternoon. Today's lecture we are going to devote on a theme which is very significant theme from the point of view of political theory, that is conservatism in political theory. In fact, this entire usage of the term conservative and the ism suffixed with it, which makes it conservatism, needs to be understood properly. Because in fact what happens that this ism or this ideology, one can say, at times is confused with liberalism and also certain other variants of ideologies which are the offshoots of liberalism itself. In fact, this conservative thought process is product of modern period in history, particularly 18th century and the 19th century in Europe, particularly with reference to certain revolutionary changes which swept across the western hemisphere, particularly Europe. In fact, we have to understand lot of things in context of this entire discussion on conservatism. Number one, that what it implies, what it stands for. Then we also have to see that what are the various tenets or different tenets of this thought. Then at the same time, some of the protagonists, some of the leading theoreticians, ideologues of this school, as well as we also have to see that geographical spread of this entire school of thought, because it originated in Europe, but at the same time one can see its in fact it's spread all over the world today. In fact, third world countries, it is believed, Asia, Africa and Latin America didn't come under the grip of conservative thought the way perhaps some of the European countries came under it. But nonetheless, in fact, no country has remained totally insulated from the influence of conservatism. Now, it is in this context that we have to see that it's how it has spread all over the globe, particularly in terms of its ideological and theoretical positioning. But at the same time, we also have to see that how in course of time conservatism has said its some of its ruggedness, or one can say that traditional or one can say that the orthodoxy which was associated with this conservative school of thought, and has embraced many new ideas and thereby has moderated its own in fact important tenets, and that is perhaps one of the important strength of this conservative thought process, because one thing is to be seen that this school of thought or this ideology has been very resilient. It has survived through ages, and largely on account of the fact that it has a tremendous capability to adapt according to different traditions, different national culture, and according to the changes in time and space. So therefore, what has happened that today a lot of scholars, commentators have started associating it with the birth of new right, neoliberalism, and even the right wing populism. So therefore, in fact, in today's context, this entire conservatism has been seen through the prism of authoritarian populism on the one hand, and at the same time through the neoliberal discourse which is sweeping all across the globe. So therefore, how this has happened is another important issue for us to understand in course of our discussion. Now, this lecture will be divided into two parts. Today is the part 1, where I will be looking at essentially the meaning of conservatism and its various tenets, and then of course if time permits we will also have a look at different types of conservative thought process. And then in the second part, of course, we will discuss that how conservatism has gradually merged with with the new new thought process called neo-right, neoliberalism, neo-right, neoliberalism, and so on and so forth. So it is in this context we have to see this entire issue of conservatism. First of all, what is its meaning? I mean, how to understand this conservatism? Now, of course, one thing we should remember that there are varied meanings of conservatism, and there is no one singular meaning which can be associated with it, and it stands for essentially for something which is meant to conserve, and this conservatism is basically a derivative of this word called conserve. So, in fact, this this would also mean that moderate, it also stands for moderate and cautious behavior. In fact, in terms of the lifestyle, one can say that conservatism stands for conventional and the conformist lifestyle. But at the same time, we should not forget that one of the important ingredient of conservatism is its refusal to change, and therefore, at times when any resistance to change happens, any resistance to reform happens, any resistance to movement happens, then of course one says that this is a conservative action, a conservative thought, because it is resisting change. So, in fact, it is in this context that we should understand the uses of the term conservatism. Of course, its usage in modern times has largely been in context of certain revolutionary changes which started taking place in Europe in 18th century, and in fact particularly the French Revolution, which I will be referring later. Now, 19th century, in fact, this was described as a distinctive political position and ideology. By 19th century, it got associated with the distinctive political positioning and ideology. In fact, it was largely a reaction against the growing pace of economic and political changes, particularly in the aftermath of French Revolution. What happened, that French Revolution of 1789 was a major event in modern human history, and there were many reactions to it, and one of the powerful reaction against French Revolution was the birth of this conservative thought. And in fact, the high priest of this conservatism is Edmund Burke, and particularly his book Reflections on the Revolution in France is the best testimony of this fact, that how French Revolution led to the birth of new ideas and new ideology in form of this conservatism. Now, one thing we should remember, that what happened around that time, that is basically 18th century, that it was not only revolution in political sphere, but number of changes were taking place in economy, in culture, in society, and on account of those changes, along with of course the massive industrialization which was taking place, it was completely changing the entire fabric of society. In fact, industrialization, urbanization, all these things came as a package, as a which what happened, that traditional values and customary practices were getting uprooted, and it was in this context that such reactions can be seen, that how a group of scholars, thinkers reacted against those things, and they in fact thought that it was a very ominous development so far as human history is concerned. In fact, what happened, that in United Kingdom these conservatives replaced Tory as a principal opposition to Whigs, because before this conservative party took birth in United Kingdom, in fact the entire political spectrum was divided between two political formations. One was called Tory, another was called Whigs, and in fact what happened, that in course of time these conservatives particularly when in terms of nomenclature replaced these Tory, and in fact the Whigs they became a principal opposition party to the Whigs, and therefore this official name of Tories as conservative came in 1835. So therefore, United Kingdom, one can see the impact of such reactions in politics also. It was not only in terms of ideas, but now even the political formations started getting associated with these ideas, even in terms of their nomenclature. Now, if we look at the historical context of this entire conservative thought, then what we find, that the political economic change which was happening in Europe due to French Revolution, as I mentioned in 1789, was the immediate context of the birth of this conservative thought. In fact, as I mentioned, that Edmund Burke can be considered the high priest of conservative thought, but along with Edmund Burke there are some other thinkers as well, about whom I will discuss shortly, particularly Oxford in England, and even Tocqueville is at times considered as one of the associates of conservative thought, though one thing we should remember that Tocqueville is also one of the very important voice in the liberal tradition. And therefore, as I mentioned in the beginning, that at times this the dividing line between the conservatives and the liberals is very thin, because there are certain issues on which some of the thinkers share a common ground, particularly a thinker like Tocqueville, but at the same time on other issues they appear to be also a liberal voice or a liberal mind, or belonging to liberal tradition. But so far Burke is concerned, in fact it is not just a chance that he is considered the high priest of conservatism, because of unambiguous assertion of the conservative position. As I mentioned that among his books, the Reflections on the Revolution in France, written in 1790, immediately after the French Revolution, is perhaps often referred as the classic work of a conservative thought. In fact, Burke regretted a revolutionary challenge to ancient regime, because what happened in France in fact completely disturbed him. He got completely shaken by the events in France, and therefore in fact he started making comparison between the French Revolution and the English revolutions, particularly of 17th century, and also 18th century, the Glorious Revolution, and Burke thought that the English revolutions were more rooted in tradition, customs, and therefore they were to be cherished, unlike the French Revolution, which in his opinion was more cataclysmic, and therefore completely transform the social and cultural fabric of human beings. So therefore he regretted the revolutionary challenge to ancient regime, which happened in form of French Revolution. In fact, along with the French Revolution, as I mentioned, that 19th century was witnessing massive industrialization in Europe, particularly in light of the birth of capitalism, a scientific revolution, and at the same time the industrial revolution which came later. And because of this industrialization, there was a massive transformation in the nature of Western states, and therefore we should not forget the birth of modern nation state was also the fallout of all these developments, particularly after Treaty of Westphalia. So what happened, that the way the states were getting transformed due to all these things, in fact also had a very powerful impact on many thinkers who basically reflected from the standpoint of conservatism. Now, one thing we should remember, that the changes I have just now mentioned also led to new churning, and some of those churnings were ideological in nature, and therefore what we find, that the birth of three important ideologies at that period, around that time, can be attributed to those changes, in fact which I outlined earlier. In fact, the birth of liberalism, birth of socialism, and also nationalism, as an ideology, in fact came in quick succession of one another. And what we find, that these three ideologies were talking about reform, they were talking about sometimes they supported revolution as well, and therefore in fact and were also legitimizing and justifying some of the events in modern history, particularly 17th century and 18th century events like French Revolution and similar other events in history. So therefore many scholars were getting unnerved and disturbed by these developments, particularly the way these ideologies like liberalism, socialism were preaching reform and also at times supporting revolution. So, therefore, conservatism as a school of thought stood firmly in defense of traditional social order, which was basically under threat due to the rise of these ideologies. Now, conservative thought, in fact, what happened that interestingly, as I mentioned earlier also, that abandoned its stubbornness later and started adapting itself to new traditions, new national culture, different national culture. That is the kind of adaptability which was one of the significant feature of conservatism, unlike other ideologies like liberalism, socialism and other ideologies which were not ready to shed its ruggedness or were ready to shed its of course its main moorings. So, what we find that it is in this context, that is 19th century, 18th 19th century Europe, that one can look at the birth of this conservative thought. Now, what has happened that I was mentioning that there is a tremendous capability or capacity in this conservative thinkers as well as this conservative thought to adapt itself according to different traditions and different national culture, and it is best borne out by the fact that today it has embraced new right, neoliberalism and right wing populism, the three words which are basically very dominant and popular in contemporary political discourse. What we find that new right, new liberalism and right wing populism have many features which do not resemble with the original tenets of conservatism, but nonetheless we find that today they are basically coexisting, cohabiting with the conservative thought and conservative principles in a manner where one can say that conservatism has allowed these new political movements, new political ideas to easily embrace some of the tenets and features of conservatism. Now, it is in this context that we also have to see that how United Kingdom, the Burke was a major influence who didn't preach a blind resistance to change. One thing to be remembered, that the moment we talk of conservatism, we normally mean that any resistance to change or basically any no change will be tolerated or allowed. But what was the strength of Burkean political thought? That Burke always allowed a basically qualified change. He always qualified change. In fact, he didn't preach a blind resistance to change. Rather, he thought that in order to survive, in order to conserve, there is always a need for change. But what he would like to say, that a prudent willingness to change in order to conserve, because if really the purpose is to conserve, then we have to be prudent in terms of our eagerness or our ability to change. If you offer a blind resistance to change, then of course this entire act of conserving may be difficult. Now, in fact, when we turn to the key figures who can be associated with this conservative political thought, then of course, as I mentioned, that Burke can be considered its high priest, but at the same time we should not forget that along with Burke there are few others as well who are equally important. For example, Alex Stockwell in fact is another big name so far as conservative school of thought is concerned. As I mentioned that sometimes it becomes highly confusing, and because some of these names are also mentioned along with the whole liberal tradition, particularly Bate, Stockwell, or for that matter to some extent even Oxford, whom I will mention later. But Stockwell definitely, particularly his path breaking work, A Democracy in America, is considered as one of the important classical work in liberal tradition. But at the same time we should not forget that the kind of qualified support he offered to democracy, particularly in terms of in fact his worry, or one can say anxiety, on account of two things, particularly the expansion of the domain of equality within democracy or due to democracy, and at the same time the fear of tyranny of majority. These two things, the two riders which he gave and alerted everyone about the dangers of democratization and democracy, have made Tocqueville a very important name so far as the conservative thought is concerned. One thing we should remember, that Tocqueville was also like Burke, who was tormented by the French Revolution. Tocqueville was also a tormented soul, and belonging to aristocratic background. Tocqueville migrated to United States of America, though he was basically a French thinker, French scholar. And United States of America, when he observed the impact of American War of Independence and the way the democracy was working there, particularly in terms of the associational life in civil society, and this is perhaps one of the issue which he highlights in his work, particularly the civil society networking of relationships. In fact, he was totally impressed, and he spoke very high of the American Revolution compared to the French Revolution. But nonetheless, one thing we should remember, that the way Tocqueville in fact gave a very ambivalent account of emerging democratic order, in fact made him popular with many conservative scholars and conservative followers. Now of course Tocqueville had a profound effect on both on liberal and the conservative thought, as I mentioned, that on the one hand the liberals also draw on Tocqueville, but at the same time the Tocqueville also is used by the conservatives. So his book, this Democracy in America, is a famous piece of writing. In fact, spread in volumes, and and particularly the way he looks at the different aspects of American democracy. Now one thing we should remember, that this book I was mentioning, Democracy in America, which was published in 1835 and and 1840, because of course it was not only one volume, so two volumes. So therefore what happened, that this book was published in 1835 and 1840. In fact, as I mentioned, that he highlighted the danger of greater equality and also social mobility, that how democracy was leading to social mobility and thereby causing kind of disruption in social life. In fact, he was also alarmed by atomized individualism and the threat to traditional social bonds. So therefore, in fact, Tocqueville, one can say that in spite of not belonging purely to the conservative tradition, but nonetheless some of his ideas on democracy have made him popular with the conservative school of thought. Along with Tocqueville, there is another name which also comes in our discussion when we basically refer to conservatism. That is Carl Schmitt, and he is a German legal and political theorist. In fact, particularly his his comments on parliamentary democracy are well known. But what happened, that in fact Carl Schmitt harked back to some of the Hobbesian ideas, particularly ideas articulated by Thomas Hobbes, the British political philosopher. In fact, his book The Concept of Political, published in 1927, is also referred as a very important intervention so far as conservative thought is concerned. In fact, Carl Schmitt attacked liberal, neutralist and utopian notion of politics, because one thing is to be remembered, that particularly any liberal idea related to rationalism, any liberal thought related to utopian thinking, or one can say that any progressive ideas, any idea which basically relates to change, or any abstract idea, is often detested by the conservative thinker as a whole, be it Burke, be it Oxford, or for that matter Carl Schmitt. So, therefore, what happens that he attacked liberal, neutralist and utopian notion of politics, and thereby made a very important contribution so far as the evolution of conservative thought is concerned. Next comes Michael Oxford, another big name after Burke, and another British political philosopher. In fact, Oxford is still remembered for his very powerful intervention through his book called Rationalism in Politics 1962, where he took issues with this entire rationalist school of thought, or rationalism as a tool in politics and philosophy. In fact, his contribution to conservative tradition is immense, and therefore in fact within conservative school, in fact his contributions are branded as a conservative traditionalism. In fact, he highlighted the importance of civil association and insisted on limited province of politics. In fact, he offered a powerful defense of non-ideological style of politics. In fact, he also highlighted the intellectual limit of human beings, particularly the kind of limitless action which thinkers were associating with human beings because of reason. He basically raised serious questions on that, because he said that this entire world is bottomless and also boundless, and human beings capacity is limited, and therefore with limited capacity this boundless and bottomless world cannot be perceived in fullness or even in part, and therefore the limit of rationalism he basically underlined and highlighted. In fact, this Oxford, one can see that he stood for traditional values and established customs like a typical conservative thinker. In fact, he believed that human beings always prefer and go for something which is familiar to something unknown, and something familiar means that something about which they are more conversant with, be it tradition or custom. But anything which is abstract, which is not known, which is likely to happen due to change and reform and evolution, in fact human beings detest. That is against their nature, that is against their character, and therefore in fact we should always prefer something which is more familiar compared to what is unknown. In fact, after looking at briefly some of these key thinkers or key protagonists of conservative thought, one can have a look at the geographical spread of conservative thinking. As I mentioned, that essentially started or originated in Europe, particularly in aftermath of French Revolution of 1789, but in fact geographical spread of this school or this thought did not remain confined to Europe and gradually spread to other parts as well. And what has happened, as I was mentioning, and perhaps we will be discussing more on this in our next lecture, that with the advent of this libertarian thought, particularly within liberalism and the new right and birth of new right along with neoliberalism and the new version in politics, what we see today as authoritarian populism, particularly in some of the developing countries, along with in some of the European countries today, one can say that many tenets of conservatism have been appropriated, so to say, or one can say that they have embraced some of the features of conservatism. So therefore, what we find that a very interesting cohabitation of two different ideologies is taking place today, and therefore that has in fact obliged many commentators to say that conservatism is dead today, because what we see today is not something with which conservative thought was associated earlier. But at the same time, some other commentators who are favorably disposed toward these developments would say that with this new embracing, or one can say that with this new incarnation, the conservative thought has got a new lease of life, and particularly its fortunes has completely taken a new shape, particularly political fortunes and electoral fortunes, due to this populism, right wing populism, or one can say the neoliberalism, both in politics and economy. Of course, we will have more discussion on these things, particularly how far they can be considered as something which is basically closely tied with conservatism today, because some of the features of conservatism they are working with, some of the tenets of conservatism they are simply trying to practice in politics, but at the same time there are other aspects of liberalism they are also embracing, and therefore this combination, one can say that they are trying to harmonize two different types of principles, tenets and ideologies, which at one point of time was believed to be diametrically opposed, or if not diametrically opposed, then of course belonging to two different traditions and two different thought process. But today they have started cohabiting with each other, and rather one can say that this interesting combination, the mixture is in politics, has created a new situation, a new churning, where on the one hand some commentators feel that conservatism has been given a new lease of life through this innovation, or one can say the innovative act in politics, be it right wing populism, or one can say neoliberalism, or neo rights. But anyway, coming to this geographical spread, in fact, as I mentioned that initially this conservative thought was associated with United Kingdom, particularly in 19th century, particularly in aftermath of the French Revolution, and it is here I mentioned Edmund Burke, particularly the comparison he made between the English Revolution and the French Revolution, reflections on the revolution in France, where he was basically berating this entire revolutionary act or politics of France for completely going against tradition, for attacking ancient regime, for not basing rights on customs, because they were based on abstract rights like liberty, equality, justice and fraternity, which conservative thinkers totally detest. They feel that only those rights are meaningful which are based or anchored in customs and traditions, and Burke thought that the British Revolution anchored human rights particularly in customs and traditions, and therefore he was totally enamored of the British Revolution, and he was very skeptical, and also to some extent one can say disturbed by what had happened in France in 1789. In fact, there in Britain we find that along with this we also found a defense of political and social order. As we know that the British entire tradition is based on conventions, customs and traditions, and that was basically the result of English Revolution, the way that happened, unlike France and United States of America. So therefore it was more evolutionary in nature than revolutionary, and in fact of course one thing we should not forget, that even in Britain when absolute monarchy was abolished, and in place of absolute monarchy concept of limited monarchy emerged, and also the parliamentary democracy. These were changes, but nonetheless not as cataclysmic, not as disruptive as perhaps the French Revolution. So what happens that, as I mentioned, that essentially in Britain it emerged as a reaction against the revolution of 17th century, particularly the end of absolutist monarchy, as I mentioned, the Puritan Revolution, and that was also not to be lost sight of, that along with French Revolution this also might have been in the background, or one can say back of the mind of these thinkers, particularly the way Britain had witnessed this major development. But nonetheless French Revolution was the major impact. Now in Britain of course this tradition survived, and survived till now, as I mentioned earlier, that even a political party's name got changed and was rechristened as a conservative party, particularly the Tories gradually became the conservatives, and and that political party or that political tradition or formation has survived till now. Of course, the liberals also were there, and the name also, of course, particularly the Tories, the way they don this new name conservative is suggestive of the fact that how much popular it was with the people, or one can say the elites. So therefore, what we find that in UK this tradition not only emerged and originated, but survived for long. Coming to the USA, the second important area, particularly in Anglo-Saxon world, one can say here, in fact, interestingly, conservative ideas were never very popular. They had a very limited impact, or one can say that little impact on people, on the masses, on elites, and therefore we do not find any important conservative thinker emerging in USA. Of course, I mentioned Tocqueville, but he was a French, and he was a tormented soul, aristocrat, belonging to French aristocratic background. And when United States he visited, he was carrying his experience about the France, and therefore reflected on the American Revolution. But one thing here we should remember, and that United States of America, particularly the kind of revolution they witnessed was purely in liberal mold, particularly the way they talked about rights. Thomas Paine, rights of men was a very important classical, one can say the high point so far as this American discourse on rights was concerned, and many other innovative ideas which took place in United States were essentially within the liberal mold and liberal fold, and therefore what we find that conservative ideas did not have much much purchase in United States of America, and because United States of America not only was for change and reform, but they were trying to create altogether new social order. So therefore, any resistance to change or any resistance to a new order would have been detrimental to this entire project, which perhaps United States was, and therefore in fact conservative ideas never did get a very sound sound base, or one can say sound footing United States of America, because what happened that essentially the liberal progressive values were cherished by Americans, and therefore be it liberty, be it equality, be it justice, in fact and all these things which are not only detested but also run down by conservative thinkers were considered perhaps essential ingredient of American way of thinking, American life. But in fact what has happened that particularly since 1960s, scholars and the commentators point out that an overtly conservative values have basically entered into the life and discourse of the political parties, the two political parties United States of America, the Republicans and the Democrats, and therefore what has happened that the kind of picture normally you get about United States of America in formative period, particularly in aftermath of revolution and for a long period after that, that is no longer valid. Today we find that many conservative values have entered in their political discourse, and one thing here I would like to mention that in 80s, particularly after the ascendancy of Reagan, President Reagan, or one can say that after he arrived on the political horizon, and the kind of discourse which he preached and promoted with the help of his economic advisor Friedman, what has come to be known as Reaganomics and the new right, about which we will discuss more in our second lecture. In fact they are indicative of this fact that how some of the conservative elements are basically entering into the political life of United States of America. So therefore this statement which is normally made that conservative ideas had little impact on United States of America may not be true for today, and therefore, the kind of populism particularly the right wing populism as it is today referred to in fact today can be even applied to United States of America with the new presidency of Trump. So, what happened that this entire issue of United States of America and conservative ideas, because United States is considered to be the classical land of liberalism and liberal ideas, may be true for the past, but may not be fully applicable for the present, as some of the tenets of conservatism have entered in new garb, or one can say have a new incarnation there. Now, coming to the third area, that is Europe itself, but not the of Anglo-Saxon brand, and here I am essentially referring to the continental Europe, be it Germany, France, Italy, or other continental countries. Here in fact we find that conservatism not only took root, but had a different type of appearance and form, and here in fact conservatism had authoritarian form, unlike Anglo-Saxon world where conservatism had few interesting and distinctive features which I mentioned. Number one, that they were not blindly resisting reform and change, they were trying to be moderate in their approach, they are accommodative. Therefore, as I mentioned that Burke's famous statement that in order to conserve you have to change. If you resist change altogether, then it would become difficult to survive and conserve. But this continental Europe, we find that this resistance to change was basically totally blind. For example, they were totally in defense of monarchy, and they were finding it difficult to get in terms with the modern democratic ideas, and therefore in fact democracy was not only detested, but some of the thinkers who were associated with conservative thought, they were very critical of this entire process of democratization. They were they were firmly behind this absolute monarchy. What we find that this rigid autocratic values were always pitted against reform, and these autocratic values were not only preached and cherished, but they were considered far superior to democratic progressive reform. What we find that after Second World War, in fact there is some change in this entire politics in continental Europe, particularly after birth of Christian democratic parties in some countries like Germany, Italy, and so on and so forth. What we find that a gradual acceptance of political democracy and social reform started taking place. The kind of resistance, kind of skepticism, kind of ambivalence, or one can say the way they detested democracy altogether was no longer true. Now there was, one can say, the selective adaptation in terms of democratic political democracy and the social reform which accompanied political democracy. And here we find that the birth of Christian democratic party in these countries, Germany, Italy, and other countries were a significant development so far as this new transformation of conservative thought in continental Europe was concerned. Now, coming to the next geographical spread, or one can say that zone, where we can take Asia, Africa, and Latin America, which are normally referred as the third world countries. In fact, the political movement to resist change and preserve traditional way of life, in fact, have been there, but not the way perhaps the way we find in continental Europe or Anglo-Saxon world, because some of these countries were witnessing in fact powerful decolonization movement, anti-colonial movement, and therefore resisting change would have been slightly detrimental to those politics. But at the same time, one cannot totally ignore that impact of these conservative thoughts of some of these movements, and some of the thinkers in the third world countries they worked and talked about those tenets of which are normally associated with conservatism, be it emphasis on experience, be it a kind of stressing on tradition, customs, arguing against reason, and all these things one can find in some thinkers. In fact, interestingly, sometimes Gandhian thought is also presented in that light, but one thing to be remembered, that Gandhi's thought is much more broader than this, which can be purely captured in this liberal conservative binaries, because of course it is true that he emphasized experience, which conservative thinkers also do. He emphasized tradition, but nonetheless his emphasis on tradition was not unqualified, rather he had a very qualified take on tradition, and therefore many scholars have called him critical traditionalist. But there were not only Gandhi, because Gandhi, I told you, that cannot be strictly put in this liberal conservative binary, because he had altogether a different philosophical horizon. But then other thinkers in third world countries can be put in this category. But one thing is very important to remember, that even if some of the thinkers in Asia, Africa and Latin America talked about resisting change and preserving traditional way of life, but they seldom employed conservative argument and values the way normally it is associated with conservative thought. Of course, there can be one can make an exception in form of Japan, particularly Japanese Liberal Party, which was founded in 1955. In fact, it talked about and preached traditional Japanese values and customs. At the same time, also loyalty, duty and other tenets of conservative school. So therefore, Japan, and particularly the Japanese Liberal Party, which was founded in 1955, could be considered an exception to the general situation which I have just mentioned, Asia, Africa, Latin America. But that is not true today. What has happened, that I was mentioning, that after this tight embrace we can see between neo-right, neoliberalism, right wing populism and some of the tenets of conservatism, as it is happening in Anglo-Saxon world and continental Europe, similar thing is happening in Asia, Africa and Latin America, and many countries are basically under the grip of populist authoritarian regimes, and therefore what has happened, that for example even earlier, for example in Argentina, particularly the regime associated with Persian, or Iran, particularly Ayatollah Khomeini, in fact when they talked about a strong central authority, they mobilized mass popular support on issue of nationalism, economic progress, and when they articulated and preached traditional values, one can say that one could see the birth of this populist authoritarian conservative thought process in these Asian, African and Latin American countries. But in fact, of course, in a new incarnation, because as I mentioned that even if they talk about these tenets, these values, but they hardly employ, or they basically hardly couch them in the conservative idioms and conservative language. Now of course, when coming to the tenets of conservatism, there are many tenets, and those tenets have to be understood properly. But as I mentioned earlier, that this conservatism is a highly resilient thought. In fact, it is modest as well as flexible, and perhaps that is the reason that it is so resilient. They do not have any fixed ideas. In fact, and from time to time, as I mentioned, that they keep adapting, they keep changing. Now in 70s, when the major transformation happened, as I was mentioning earlier also, particularly birth of new right, and later on when this neoliberal discourse came, what happened at that time, that there was a growing concern at welfare state and the economic management which state was doing, particularly in aftermath of this Keynesian discourse or Keynesian ideas. In fact, there was some sort of new churning, and it was in this context that this twin ideologies, or one can say the twin discourses emerged, one in Britain, another United States of America, and they have been called Thatcherism and Reaganomics. Thatcherism is associated with two names, Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, and her advisor Hayek, and Reaganomics is associated with Reagan, the American president, and his economic advisor Friedman, which gave birth to Thatcherism and Reaganomics. And this radical and ideological brand of conservatism, emerged with this new development, particularly due to the changes in 70s. As I mentioned, that when the welfare state, which had gained powerful ground after Second World War, or around that time, after this Keynesian discourse became quite popular and dominant, and so therefore there was a kind of reaction against these things, and the birth of new right can be seen here. Here we find a radical and ideological brand of conservatism is emerging, and here we find that the merger between the two, the earlier classical tenets of conservatism and the new right brand of liberalism is materializing, and that is perhaps something very interesting and which had far reaching impact. And therefore I mentioned that from new right it became, it came to neoliberal, and from neoliberal it coming to populism. Now, so therefore there are many tenets. Of course, ideology of free market and other thing is important tenet of contemporary conservatism, but not strictly one can say that was applying to the classical conservatives. In next lecture we will be looking at some of these tenets and also some of the forms of conservatism, because there are different forms, in fact, and those forms are to be seen that in what forms those, or one can say different types of conservatism, 6-7 types, along with some of the core ideas of this this ideology. So in fact in next lecture we will be looking at all these issues.